The mathematical burn rate of a single Nimitz-class aircraft carrier is staggering. In a standard 24-hour combat cycle, 100,000 tons of sovereign United States territory consumes millions of gallons of JP-5 aviation fuel, fires millions of dollars in precision ordnance, and requires 18,000 high-calorie meals just to keep the crew of 5,000 sailors conscious and functional. Now multiply that burn rate by 3. In the late winter of 2026, as the United States and Israel launched a massive, coordinated air campaign against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps infrastructure in Iran, the Pentagon ordered a brutal logistical concentration. The USS Gerald R. Ford was locked into the eastern Mediterranean. The USS Abraham Lincoln was holding the line in the Arabian Sea, actively dodging ballistic missiles. And to reinforce this already massive footprint, Central Command ordered a third supercarrier, the USS Carl Vinson, to rush into the theater. Concentrating 3 carrier strike groups in a single geographic region is not just a massive display of geopolitical force. It is a logistical nightmare that pushes the United States military supply chain to the absolute breaking point. How do you feed 15,000 sailors, fuel 200 fighter jets, and restock thousands of depleted missiles when the primary shipping lanes, the Suez Canal and the Strait of Hormuz, are paralyzed by Houthi and IRGC anti-ship missiles? We are going to bypass the political rhetoric of the Middle East conflict and examine the brutal, unvarnished mathematics of war. We will dissect the mechanics of a combat replenishment at sea, the physical toll on the Ordnance hauling 2,000-pound warheads, the desperate reality of jet cannibalization in the hangar bays, and the severe physiological impact on the crews who are eating powdered eggs and working 18-hour shifts to sustain this unprecedented operational tempo. This is the logistical reality of the 2026 Middle East escalation. To understand the crisis, you must first look at the geometry of the ocean. An aircraft carrier is entirely dependent on a fragile, slow-moving lifeline known as the Military Sealift Command, or the MSC. These are the unsung civilian-crewed supply ships, the fleet oilers and dry cargo ammunition ships that constantly shadow the combat fleet. Under normal peacetime conditions, a carrier receives a resupply known as a RAS replenishment at sea every week to 10 days. But the Middle East in the spring of 2026 is not a peacetime environment. The Red Sea is a designated kill zone. Commercial logistics companies have halted transit through the Suez Canal due to relentless Houthi ballistic and drone attacks. The Strait of Hormuz is functionally closed. This means the supply ships feeding the Gerald R. Ford, the Abraham Lincoln, and the incoming Carl Vinson must take the long way around. They are forced to transit around the Horn of Africa or pull from heavily depleted forward operating bases in Europe and the Indian Ocean. The geographic isolation extends the supply lines by thousands of miles, creating a severe bottleneck. When a supply ship finally reaches the carrier strike group, the replenishment at sea is conducted under the constant threat of attack. This is not a relaxed administrative procedure. It is a highly dangerous, intensely physical evolution. The massive Tijo fleet oiler pulls alongside the carrier. Both ships are moving at 12 to 15 knots, separated by less than 200 feet of churning ocean. The carrier's deck crew fires a shot line across the gap. Heavy steel cables are tensioned between the two vessels. Massive fuel hoses are pulled across, pumping millions of gallons of explosive JP-5 jet fuel directly into the carrier's tanks. Simultaneously, helicopters, MH-60 Nighthawks execute vertical replenishment or VERTREP. They hover over the deck of the supply ship, hook into cargo nets filled with frozen food, spare parts, and ammunition, and fly them over to the carrier's flight deck. They drop the pallets and immediately turn back for another load. The noise is deafening. The downwash from the rotors acts like a hurricane, blasting the deck crew with salt, spray, and exhaust. The moment a pallet of supplies hits the flight deck or the hangar bay, the bucket brigade is mobilized. You cannot use a forklift in the narrow, steep stairwells of an aircraft carrier. Thousands of cardboard boxes must be hand-carried by the crew. It does not matter if you are an administrative clerk, a radar operator, or a cook. During a RAS, every available body becomes a manual laborer. The crew forms a human chain, passing 50-pound boxes of frozen chicken, heavy metal tins of flour, and crates of UHT milk down vertical ladders into the deep storage freezers in the belly of the ship. They do this in 100-degree heat, wearing heavy coveralls and hard hats. It is hours of back-breaking, exhausting labor, and they must complete it before their regular 12-hour watch even begins. But food and fuel are only the baseline requirements for survival. The true purpose of concentrating 3 carriers in CENTCOM is to project destructive power. And projecting power requires ordnance. During the targeted strikes against the IRGC leadership, air defense systems, and naval assets like the drone carrier Shahid Bagheri, the Abraham Lincoln and the Gerald R Ford burned through their magazines at an astonishing rate. F-35C Lightning IIs and F/A-18 Super Hornets were launching around the clock, heavily loaded with GBU-31 Joint Direct Attack munitions, AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles, and AIM-120 air-to-air missiles. Meanwhile, the escorting cruisers and destroyers were firing million-dollar Standard missiles to intercept incoming Iranian ballistics. The process of moving a bomb from the deep magazines of the carrier to the wing of a fighter jet is an industrial ballet fraught with peril. Deep below the waterline, in the heavily armored, climate-controlled weapons magazines, the aviation ordnancemen, the red shirts, begin the build process. A bomb does not arrive fully assembled. The bomb body, the explosive filler, the tail fins, and the computer guidance kits are stored separately for safety. The red shirts must physically bolt these components together. A single GBU-31 JDAM weighs 2,000 pounds. Once assembled, the bombs are loaded onto specialized hydraulic elevators that travel up through the armored decks of the ship, eventually breaching the flight deck. On the roof, the environment is chaotic. It is 130 degrees. Jet exhaust is blinding. The deck is pitching in the ocean's swell. The red shirts use small, low-profile tractors and manual heavy-lift carts to transport the 2,000-pound warheads across the non-skid surface. They maneuver them under the wings of the waiting fighter jets. A mechanical hoist is used, but the final alignment requires sheer human muscle. 4 or 5 exhausted 19-year-olds must physically push, heave, and guide the massive steel bomb onto the mounting lugs of the aircraft pylon until it clicks into place. They do this inches away from a jet engine that is spooling up to full military power. If a sailor slips, or if a chain snaps, a ton of high explosives drops onto the steel deck. When an aircraft carrier conducts sustained combat operations for weeks on end, the ordnance supply dwindles rapidly. A carrier only holds a finite number of precision-guided munitions. When 3 carriers are operating simultaneously, the Pentagon must pull weapons from strategic reserves across the globe. Heavy transport aircraft, C-17 Globemasters, fly these weapons to forward bases where they are loaded onto supply ships and sent into the combat zone. If the logistics chain falters, the carriers become nothing more than floating runways with unarmed jets. And those jets are breaking. The harsh environment of the Middle East is fundamentally hostile to complex aviation machinery. The salt air is highly corrosive. The fine sand and dust blowing off the Arabian Peninsula acts like sandpaper inside the delicate internal architecture of an F-135 jet engine. When a carrier increases its sortie generation rate, launching jets continuously for defensive patrols and offensive strikes, the wear and tear on the air wing multiplies exponentially. Landing gear struts are slammed onto the deck during arrested recoveries. Hydraulic lines burst under extreme pressure. Radar cooling systems fail in the intense desert heat. The aviation machinists' mates, the green shirts, are forced into a desperate battle of mechanical triage. The hangar bay becomes a high-stakes trauma ward for fighter jets. It spans the length of 3 football fields, but it is packed tight with aircraft. The noise of power tools, pneumatic drills, and testing equipment is constant. When the supply chain is bottlenecked by the closure of the Red Sea, spare parts do not arrive on time. You cannot simply order a new titanium compressor blade on Amazon. If an F-18 needs a specific hydraulic actuator to fly and the supply ship carrying that part is delayed, the maintenance chiefs are forced to make a brutal logistical decision: cannibalization. Cannibalization is the process of stripping a perfectly good working part from one grounded aircraft to fix another. If Jet A is waiting on an engine replacement, it is effectively a multi-million-dollar paperweight. If Jet B suffers a failure of its targeting pod, the mechanics will physically rip the targeting pod out of Jet A and install it in Jet B. This keeps the maximum number of jets in the air, but it creates a massive compounding maintenance debt. For every part that is cannibalized, the mechanics have to do double the labor. They have to remove it from the donor jet, install it in the receiving jet, and then, weeks later, when the new part finally arrives, they have to install it back into the original donor jet. During the 2026 strikes, as the 3 carriers demanded maximum flight availability, the cannibalization rate skyrocketed. The green shirts were working 16 to 18 hours a day, sleeping on the cold steel floors of the hangar bay next to their toolboxes, sustained entirely by caffeine and nicotine, trying to keep a crumbling air wing operational. While the machines require fuel and parts, the human engine of the carrier strike group requires calories and psychological resilience. Feeding 15,000 personnel across 3 carrier groups in a combat zone is a mathematical impossibility without heavy reliance on highly processed foods. Because the supply ships are delayed, the carriers face a severe and prolonged fresh food cliff. When a carrier leaves a port, it is loaded with fresh lettuce, tomatoes, fruit, and dairy milk, but fresh produce decays. By the end of the second week at sea, the salad bar vanishes. The menu transitions to survival logistics. The culinary specialists must prepare meals using ingredients that can survive for months in a frozen or unrefrigerated hold. The fluid milk is replaced by UHT milk, ultra-high temperature pasteurized milk. It comes in a cardboard box, requires no refrigeration, and has a thick, sweet, cooked flavor that sailors despise but consume out of desperate caloric necessity. The fresh eggs are replaced by cartons of liquid egg product, and eventually by dehydrated yellow egg powder, which is reconstituted with water and aggressively seasoned with hot sauce and bacon grease to mask the chemical texture. The primary diet becomes heavy, dense comfort food. The hamster, the deep-fried hockey puck-shaped chicken cordon bleu, becomes the staple of the mess deck. The ship's bakery works through the night, producing thousands of loaves of bread because the smell of fresh yeast is one of the only psychological comforts left on board. The galley operates 24 hours a day. The most critical meal is midrats or midnight rations. Served from 23:00 to midnight, it is a bizarre combination of dinner leftovers and breakfast food. Sailors covered in jet grease, hydraulic fluid, and the heavy, musky smell of the amine air scrubbers sit under harsh fluorescent lights, eating pancakes and ravioli while the ship executes high-speed tactical turns in the dark. It is a moment of shared, exhausted misery. The concentration of three carriers in the Middle East does not just impact the sailors in the Arabian Sea. It creates a massive, dangerous ripple effect across the entire globe. The United States Navy operates a finite number of aircraft carriers. Currently, there are 11 active supercarriers. However, at any given time, a third of the fleet is in deep maintenance dry docks undergoing multi-year nuclear refits. Another third is in the pre-deployment workup phase, training new crews. This leaves only 3 or 4 carriers available for global deployment. By pulling the Gerald R. Ford, the Abraham Lincoln, and the Carl Vinson into the CENTCOM theater, the Pentagon has effectively stripped the Pacific and Atlantic fleets of their primary deterrents. If a sudden crisis erupts in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait, the United States has no immediate carrier strike group available to respond. The logistical blanket is not big enough to cover the entire world, and by pulling it entirely over the Middle East, the rest of the globe is left exposed. Furthermore, you cannot keep a carrier at sea indefinitely. A ship is a degrading asset. The nuclear reactors can run for decades, but the steel pipes, the water evaporators, the arresting gear cables, and the human minds on board have a strict expiration date. The USS Abraham Lincoln is already infamous for its brutal 294-day deployment in 2022. By trapping the ship in a combat zone in 2026 alongside the Ford and the Vinson, the Navy is forcing unprecedented deployment extensions. An extension is the most psychologically devastating order a sailor can receive. The crew is given a date to return home. They tell their spouses. They promise their children they will be there for birthdays and graduations. They begin to pack their sea bags in a phenomenon known as channel fever. And then the captain comes over the 1MC intercom. The orders have changed. The geopolitical situation demands their presence. They are not going home. The emotional crash is catastrophic. The ship goes quiet. The suicide watch protocols are quietly elevated by the medical department. The crew is forced to swallow their grief, return to the sweltering heat of the engineering spaces, and continue to fix the jets and load the bombs. They are entirely cut off from the surface world, receiving only heavily censored, text-only family grams to connect them to the lives they left behind. Concentrating 3 carrier strike groups in the Middle East is the ultimate test of American logistical supremacy. It is a flex of industrial might that no other nation on Earth can replicate. But that capability is not magic. It is paid for in blood, sweat, and the rapid degradation of multi-billion-dollar assets. It is paid for by the supply ship captains navigating a gauntlet of Houthi missiles. It is paid for by the red shirts risking their lives to hoist 2,000 pounds of high explosives under the wing of a fighter jet. It is paid for by the green shirts cannibalizing engines in a 120-degree hangar bay. And it is paid for by the thousands of sailors eating powdered eggs, sleeping in aluminum coffins, and watching their lives pass by on a calendar they have no control over. The logistics of escalation are brutal. A supercarrier is not an infinite resource. It is a fragile, isolated city that requires a massive, highly vulnerable tether to survive. As the conflict in the Middle East drags on, the question is not whether the carriers can fight. The question is how long the human machinery below the deck can sustain the math before the system fundamentally breaks. If this deep dive into the brutal logistics of sustaining 3 aircraft carriers in a combat zone changed your perspective on naval warfare, let me know in the comments below. Could you endure the psychological toll of a massive deployment extension while working 18-hour shifts in the Arabian Sea? Hit the like button to help push this documentary into the algorithm. And if you want to understand the true, uncensored mechanics of the military world, make sure you subscribe to the channel and ring the bell. The ocean is vast, the supply lines are stretched thin, and there are many more stories hidden beneath the flight deck. Until next time, stay sharp and keep your eyes on the horizon.